Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Chapter 10. Fecundity. Fecundity is the mirror chapter to Chapter 8, Intricacy. While Chapter 8 was the intense climax to Dillard's via positiva ideas, fecundity is the change of direction. It is the first chapter of the via negativa portion. And while she ended Chapter 8 with an effusion of beauty, appreciating and drinking in the infinite, intricate texture of the world, fecundity takes the same picture and casts a different light on it. It pulls back the curtain to reveal that intricacy and the beauty that is found in intricacy is actually part of a system driven by rank fecundity. The powerful pressure and need to grow and feed and produce and die. And from this perspective, it looks a lot less pretty, and even somewhat horrifying. You'll notice throughout this chapter that there are a lot of mirrors to the intricacy chapter. In fact, in the second half of the book, we'll see lots of echoes of the first half, but with a different perspective. Keep your eyes open for those same images you saw in the first half. The chapter opens with a dream, a nightmare. This contrasts with the dream at the end of Intricacy, which was a beautiful dream of the texture of the universe through time. This time, though, she's dreaming about mating moths who fill her bed with fish eggs. And somehow in the dream, it's her own fault that this has happened, because of her curiosity. She says, "I brought it upon myself, this slither, this swarm." It's her need to witness nature and the workings of nature that has led her to ultimately have to reject her previous ideas. She also reminds us of the flood, and points out that nature stages a comeback after a flood. But this comeback isn't a pretty thing. Rapid population explosions lead to a lot of death. On page 163, she declares her change of purpose, saying, "This is what I plan to do. Partly as a result of my terrible dream, I have been thinking that the landscape of the intricate world that I have painted is inaccurate and lopsided. It is too optimistic. For the notion of the infinite variety of detail and the multiplicity of forms is a pleasing one. In complexity are the fringes of beauty, and in variety are generosity and exuberance. But all this leaves something vital out of the picture. It is not one pine I see, but 1,000. I myself am not one, but legion, and we are all going to die. In this repetition of individuals is a mindless stutter, an imbecilic fixedness that must be taken into account. The driving force behind all this fecundity is a terrible pressure I also must consider, the pressure of birth and growth, the pressure that splits the bark of trees and shoots out seeds, that squeezes out the egg and bursts the pupa, that hungers and lusts and drives the creature relentlessly towards its own death. Fecundity, then, is what I have been thinking about. Fecundity and the pressure of growth. Fecundity is an ugly word for an ugly subject. Fecundity is a term that refers to producing many offspring. And so throughout this chapter, Dillard is going to be looking at why the world pours out so much life only to have it eaten up and destroyed. That mass production and mass death make the individual life feel pretty insignificant. And if life doesn't matter on the individual scale, then what's it all about? She starts her exploration by looking at plants. Plants don't offend our sensibilities quite so much. And yet the intense power, pressure, and growth within the plant world is mind-boggling as well. However, once she begins to look at that growth pressure and production in the animal kingdom, it gets more disturbing. She says, "Fecundity is anathema only in the animal. Acres and acres of rats has a suitably chilling ring to it that is decidedly lacking if I say instead acres and acres of tulips." She gives several examples of great outpourings of life, such as the rock barnacle, and she points out on page 168, the barnacles encrusting a single half-mile of shore can leak into the water 1,000,000 larvae. After mulling this over for a moment, on page 169, she says, "What if God has the same affectionate disregard for us that we have for barnacles? I don't know if each barnacle larva is of itself unique and special, or if we, the people, are essentially as interchangeable as bricks. My brain is full of numbers. They swell and would split my skull like a shell. I examine the trapezoids of skin covering the backs of my hands like blown dust motes moistened to clay. I have hatched too, with millions of my kind, into a Milky Way that spreads from an unknown shore. Do these million larvae of barnacles matter? And what about me? Can I, as an individual human within a huge, vast population of humanity, matter? She describes further the massive egg production of various insects, but also points out the horrific fact that this production of eggs must come from somewhere. In order to fuel this production, these insects must eat and eat. And sometimes this need to devour in order to produce offspring goes awry in horrific ways. And Dillard describes several instances throughout the animal kingdom, not exclusive to insects, of parents eating their own eggs. Of course, on the other hand, we have the offspring that hatch and then eat the parent. She talks specifically about the icknewman flies. The icknewman is a parasitic fly that lays eggs on caterpillars. The eggs then hatch and eat the host. However, if the icknewman cannot find a suitable host on which to lay her eggs, the eggs could burst within her and eat her alive. This is a pretty gross chapter. At this point, like in the intricacy chapter, Dillard switches to second person. You are an icknewman. You mated and your eggs are fertile. If you can't find a caterpillar on which to lay your eggs, your young will starve. When the eggs hatch, the young will eat anybody in which they find themselves. So if you don't kill them by emitting them broadcast over the landscape, they'll eat you alive. But if you let them drop over the fields, you will probably be dead yourself of old age before they even hatch to starve, and the whole show will be over and done, and a wretched one it was. You feel them coming, and you struggle to rise. Not that the icknewman is making any conscious choice. If she were, her dilemma would be truly the stuff of tragedy. Aeschylus need look no further than the icknewman. That is, it would be the stuff of real tragedy if only Aeschylus and I could convince you that the icknewman is really and truly as alive as we are, and that what happens to it matters. Will you take it on faith? Again, the question. If I can dismiss this bug as not mattering, then her plight is merely gross trivia. But when this picture becomes a microcosm of the universe, when we look at it to try to create an ideology, why is the universe the way it is, and what does that mean about me? Part 2 of the chapter first talks about millions of ways to die. Some creatures just really have a hard time surviving. There are so many different ways they can run out of resources and starve, or be devoured and eaten by others, or be destroyed by their environments. And so it seems that a lot of nature just mass produces offspring, even these brilliantly intricate and complex creatures that she so marveled at in the intricacy chapter, so that millions can die and a handful can survive. Again, she uses the second person approach, starting on page 177, and lets the reader imagine him or herself as a manager of the Southern Railroad, creating 9,000 engines on a stretch of track that can only support 3, then letting them all crash, collide, derail, jump, jam, and burn. Such a move would obviously baffle any board of directors, and she concludes saying, is it a better way to run a universe? The last several pages of this chapter are so incredibly potent that it's difficult for me not to simply read them all to you. It's well worth taking your time unpacking these pages. It explores the complication in the fact that the world seems to appreciate life and do everything it can to preserve life, while having absolutely no regard for the individual. She says, we value the individual supremely. Nature values him not a whit. And so she comes to an insoluble problem. Either this world, my mother, is a monster, or I myself am a freak, she says. On the one hand, the world might be a monster. All this massive death and destruction, all this flinging life into the void, is part of a horrible system. But the problem with that idea is that somehow this horrible system, at the same time, produced wonderful us, she says. If it's all about destruction, why do we value beauty so much? But look at the other side. Maybe the world is right, and I am crazy. She says, do the barnacle larva care? Does the lacewing who eats her eggs care? If they do not care, then why am I making all this fuss? If I am a freak, then why don't I hush? A moment later she says, it would seem that emotions are the curse, not death. Emotions that appear to have devolved upon a few freaks as a special curse from malevolence. All right, then. It is our emotions that are amiss. We are freaks, the world is fine. Let us all go have lobotomies to restore us to a natural state. We can leave the library then, go back to the creek lobotomized, and live on its banks as untroubled as any muskrat or reed. You first. She spends the last 3 pages trying to calm herself down. She says, my rage and shock at the pain and death of individuals of my kind is the old, old mystery, as old as man, but forever fresh and completely unanswerable. My reservations about the fecundity and waste of life among other creatures is, however, mere squeamishness. After all, I'm the one having the nightmares. It is true that many of the creatures live and die abominably, but I am not called upon to pass judgment, nor am I called upon to live in that same way, and those creatures who are mercifully unconscious. She concludes by pointing out that her picture of fecundity is really a mirror of her picture of intricacy. She says, instead of one goldfish swimming in its intricate bowl, I see tons and tons of goldfish laying and eating billions and billions of eggs. The point of all the eggs is, of course, to make goldfish one by one. Nature loves the idea of the individual, if not the individual himself. And the point of the goldfish is pizzazz. This is familiar ground. I merely failed to mention that it is death that is spinning the globe. This death that is spinning the globe, which she calls a moment later the second law of thermodynamics, is an important aspect of the universe that cannot be ignored. And so she sets off into her second half of the book, the via negativa portion, where she's going to begin stripping away all that she built up in the first half, and when all is removed, see if she can find the answers there. She'll start by returning to the idea of seeing in her chapter, Stalking. We'll talk about that next time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.